Basically, I wrote the book because I got fed up with people saying it's just a midrash. Nobody would say it's just a sugya in Gittin. We don't really have to know what it means. No, of course you have to know what it means. That means you have to analyze, you have to read, you have to interpret, you have to pause, you have to ask questions, you have to put it together, you have to understand what you're reading. That said, there's something that you have to be aware of when you read Midrash. The redactors of the texts that we're talking about, whether they were in the Gemara or in separate collections of Midrash, took oral teachings and composed them or redacted them into a final form. So when you say it's really important to know whether someone's doing pshat or drash or parshanut or darshanut, the answer is oral traditions float. You could get a midrash that's brought here in Shemot Rabbah and something similar brought in the Yerushalmi, and they will mean different things depending on the uses to which they are put.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. When you learn Torah, do you consider yourself to be in dialogue with Chazal? According to my guest, Simi Peters, a key element of learning Midrash aggadah is being able to become participants in that conversation. I recorded this episode last week, and I was inspired by listening to Simi's innovative and compelling explanations of what Midrash is, what its place is when learning Torah, and the methodologies that we should employ in order to understand it. But this interview, and this idea of being in conversation with our sages, became even more timely for me in the aftermath of a radio interview I participated in on Talkline with Zev Brenner earlier today. I appeared together with Rabbi Avi Shafran, the spokesman for Aggadah Israel of America, to talk about the recent Supreme Court decision which mandated that the IDF begin drafting previously exempt Haredi men into the army. Without trying to oversimplify Rabbi Shafran's point of view, it seemed to me to largely be that any sources I brought were irrelevant, as the Haredi community will follow their gedolim or great scholars through thick and thin. Essentially, he said that no matter what source I brought to indicate that blanket exemptions from the army for yeshiva students are not warranted by Jewish law, it was absurd to assume that the gedolim didn't know those sources better than I did, so my interpretation is almost by definition deficient. In other words, there's no need to respond to specific arguments, because we know that the gedolim know them better than we do, so anyone else's reading and interpretation is immaterial. I'll include a link to the interview in the show notes. If you think that I'm misrepresenting his position, feel free to let me know. While I don't know what Simi Peters would say about this particular issue, I take heart in her insistence that Midrash is often a dialogue between our sages then and all of us today, both you and me. I was very troubled by the attitude expressed by Rabbi Shafran, which made me feel that some in the Haredi world want to disenfranchise everyone but the select few, rendering our own interpretations and understandings somewhat pointless. In contrast, Simi said that Torah must be Torat Chaim, a living Torah, and not something that's relegated to a shelf in the library. I'm sure that many in the Haredi community would strenuously argue that they agree with this, and that listening to the Gedolim does not preclude developing our own novel interpretations. And of course, I don't claim that anyone can say anything about Torah without actually studying the text properly and with expertise. But I can't escape the feeling that if our interpretations of Torah are shunted aside in the face of an alternate interpretation by the Gedolim, and the reasoning is that if they said it, it must be true, then the Torah learned in that context by us lacks an element of life, of dialogue, of meaning. It's an intellectual exercise and perhaps a spiritual exercise, but it has no effect on our lives. It lacks the urgency of a living Torah, and it lacks the importance of a living Torah. In any event, that interview was for me a great segue into my conversation with Simi Peters. We talked about the definition of Midrash and the importance of studying midrashim, why Chazal composed midrashim in the manner that they did, whether Chazal intended for them to be taken literally or to be representative of, so to speak, what actually happened, the difference between pshat and drash, parshanut and darshanut, how our sages understood biblical language, the different methods that Chazal use in midrashim, and more. Additionally, Simi offered some methodologies that we can use in order to understand midrashim, and this is what I enjoyed the most. She gave some examples of midrashim and what to look for in order to interpret them properly. We'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Last week I released 2 new articles. The first, entitled 18.3, argues that the recent claims by politicians in an ultra-Orthodox party that the IDF does not need Haredi soldiers is disingenuous, dismissive, and cruel. The second, entitled Sages, Be Careful with Your Words, discusses the importance of Torah leaders using nuanced language, something which, sadly, seems to be a dying art. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast, or you want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Simi Peters is the author of Learning to Read Midrash, recently published in Hebrew by Magid Koren as Lifshuto Shel Midrash. She teaches Tanakh, Midrash, and Parshanut at Nishmat and Matan in Jerusalem, as well as outside Israel online. She has been involved in teacher education for many years and specializes in providing access to a wide variety of classic Jewish texts for students at all levels of Jewish literacy and experience. Simi lives in Jerusalem. Simi Peters, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
A pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
We're going to talk about methodology in learning Midrash today. The first question obviously should be, what is Midrash? Can you define the term?
Yes, I hope so. I really do. Midrash is a style of text study that is characteristic of the period of Chazal. And here I'm talking not just about Midrash aggadah, I'm talking about Midrash halacha. It's a particular approach that Chazal took to scripture, to Tanakh, right? And specifically, or not only, but very much to Chumash. Now, in Midrash Halacha, what that means is following certain kinds of, I wouldn't call them algorithms, but rules for how to learn halacha out of halachic texts in the Torah. In Midrash aggadah, it's freer, but the approach of Midrash, first of all, assumes that the biblical text is sacred, that there are no wasted words, that it has to be unpacked and, explained. And it involves a very close, nuanced reading of the text. In Midrash aggadah, it doesn't always stick strictly to context or the grammatical framework of a pasuk or all sorts of other things, but the idea is that you're taking a pasuk in the Torah, in Nevi'im or Ketuvim, and you are studying it carefully and you're analyzing it or using it in particular ways.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, but I want to ask about something specific that you said towards the end about Chazal's reverence for language. There are no extra words. We make sure that everything is explained exactly. And the reason that I'm curious about that is because one of the paradoxes that I see in learning Midrash is this obvious respect and reverence for biblical language. But it's at times it seems that respect for the language, that there's no unnecessary letter or syllable, can also lead them to go far away from the actual context that I would have assumed without Midrash. In other words, by saying this extra word means something, had that extra word not been there, or even if it is there, I never would have dreamed the idea that they're trying to present. So in that sense, it departs from the language. How do you explain that?
Okay, so one thing to understand is that there are 2 time-hallowed ways of learning biblical text. And by the way, there's when Chazal play with the text, what I call play with the text, or read it in ways that sometimes seem to us kind of out there and wild, what they're doing is they're assuming that you as a reader know the plain sense of the text. Otherwise, they couldn't play these games, and these games would not have that effect. And I use the term game not in a pejorative sense. I use the term game in the sense of a certain kind of freedom. So there are 2 things I would say that are operating here. One of them is that Chazal always were engaged in parshanut, which is biblical exegesis or interpretation, hermeneutics, or darshanut, which is, sermonics or homiletical readings of the text. And Chazal knew the difference between them, obviously. but they didn't worry so much about maintaining a rigid distinction between them. That wasn't of particular interest to them. They didn't mind flowing in and out of categories in that way. And I think the reason for that is connected to, I'm going to use an analogy from Greek culture, okay? So for the Greeks, the subject of study was the cosmos, the world, the universe, right? And they were interested in all sorts of philosophical questions, some of which we would today call scientific questions, right? So the Greeks were interested in, how did this happen? Why does this happen? What does it mean? What makes it beautiful or ugly, right? So for the Greeks, philosophers, broadly speaking, a question like, why does water flow downhill, is a philosophical question of the same nature as, is this statement true, or is this object beautiful? And the universe of study is the world, the universe, the cosmos, whatever you want to call it. Now, lahavdil, I'm going to say Chazal do the same thing with the Tanakh, right? The Tanakh, Torah Shabbal Peh. That is to say, the Tanakh and the oral tradition, right, the Torah Shabbal Peh, are their universe of study. And they ask all kinds of questions about these psukim, right, or these stories, or these halachic categories, or these statements in Tanakh or Chumash, when we're talking about halacha. And they don't make rigid distinction between them, the same way that the Greeks didn't. Now, Greek philosophy gave birth to, with the passage of time, Greek philosophy gave birth to what we would call physics, metaphysics, right? In other words, science and what we would call today philosophical questions. So philosophy is ethics, metaphysics, aesthetics. Those are philosophical questions, right? And chemistry, biology, botany, whatever, those are scientific, physics specifically, right? And the first pure science is science. What happened to change the focus? The Greek broad, voracious reading of everything in the universe got narrowed during the scientific revolution to questions about, instead of asking questions about, is this object beautiful, we're going to ask, how much does it weigh, and why does it flow downhill, or why does it float in the air, or questions which are about being quantified and analyzed, weighed, measured, tracked, described, etc. Lahavdil, that's what happened with the Rishonim, even before the Rishonim, probably with the Gaonim. They started to ask questions in areas like what we would call pshuto shel mikra, right? We're not going to look at this pasuk holistically. We are going to focus on difficulties in the text, questions of grammar, context, word meaning, etc., logic, etc. And we're going to narrow the focus, and we're going to start talking about psukim in a different way. Did I now answer that question? So for Chazal it's the Tanakh and Torah Shabbal Peh are the whole universe, and that's what they're talking about. And they're talking about it the way the Greeks talked about it before the scientific revolution, when things became more categorized and narrowed down and became particular spheres of knowledge.
Okay, I definitely understand what you mean. I'd like to focus a little more on that distinction between parshanut and darshanut, or interpretation homiletics. Just so I understand better, you say that Chazal were aware of the difference, right? Even though they linked them together, they knew the difference between pshat and drash.
Well, okay, I prefer to use the terms parshanut and darshanut, not pshat and drash, but Chazal were the authors of the statement, "Emi krayot de pshuto." Rashi didn't invent that. Emi krayot de pshuto means the text has a plain sense. They were very, very much aware of that. They also assumed that they were speaking to people who understood the difference between Emi krayot de pshuto, the text doesn't leave its plain sense, and other uses of the text, including, by the way, halachic uses, because the halachic rules are not always pshuto shel mikra. They're legal readings of the text, which is different from plain sense of the text in the sense in which we mean. Or just to give a simple example, Lifnei iver lo titein michshol, do not place a stumbling block before a blind person. In the simplest sense, as pshuto shamikra, plain sense of the text means don't place a stumbling block before a blind person. It is extended halachically to refer to not giving somebody bad advice or deceiving them into selling themselves short or all sorts of other things. Now, that's not very far from, that's certainly part of the intent of the puzzle for sure, right? But, you could imagine a different kind of reading, which is less plain sense oriented and less halachically oriented, that might go interesting places homiletically with that concept. What makes a person blind? What is a stumbling block? Why shouldn't we do this? Right? Things like that.
Let me ask you why you didn't like the terms pshat and drash in this particular case. What is the reason that you prefer using parshanut and darshanut over those other terms?
Okay, people say it's not in the pshat, and they mean it's not in the psukim. Or they'll say, or let me see if I can explain this better. It's a hard distinction. Pshat, people talk about pshat as though it's a characteristic of the text. This is the pshat. This is the drash. And in fact, as the Rashbam points out in his discussion of Rashi, when he talks about his discussions with his grandfather about this topic, he says, Rashi would have said he would have written more and further interpretations that were pshat. Is not only one pshat. But when we say pshat and drash, what most people think of is that's a characteristic of the text. This is the pshat, this is the drash, this is the so, this is the remez, right? When in fact, what you're talking about, or to use another example, Rashi, the Ramban, the Ibn Ezra, the Sforno, we could make a whole long list here. Each claim to be giving us pshuto shel mikra. Okay. And they all say different things. Frequently, they disagree with each other. Okay. They are giving us pshuto shel mikra from their perspective, but what they're doing is they're engaging in parshanut hamikra. They're interpreting the text. They're not trying to use the text as the topic of a sermon or to deliver a predetermined message. They're not using the text the way the rabbi does on Friday night when he gives a sermon in shul, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way, because one would hope that the listeners understand that what the rabbi is doing is a sermon and it's not necessarily the plain sense of the text. So I prefer to talk about parshanut and darshanut because a parshan, an interpreter of the text, can come to many different, what we would call pshatim, different plain senses of the text from his perspective based on his understanding of grammar, context, word choices, scope, all kinds of things like that. But he's still engaged in what each individual interpreter calls pshuto shel mikra. That's what he's doing. Darshanut is taking an idea. You want to talk about tshuva. You want to talk about a problem in the community. You want to talk about a chatzan or a kala. What does the darshan do? They take a Jewish text and they build a sermon around it, or they impose their sermon on the text. That's why I prefer parshanut, which is not a property of the text, but what the reader is doing with the text. And darshanut, which is not a property of the text, it's not drash. It's what the sermonizer is doing with the text. And of course, I'm giving very broad, lines. On one extreme it's this, at the other extreme it's that. But of course, there's some overlap in the middle. Oh, you know what Nechama said? We asked her, how do you define pshat and drash? And which is, probably oceans of ink have been spilled on this question. She said, pshat is what I say, drash is what you say. And she was joking.
I remember you wrote that in your book.
Yeah.
Then it seems to me that it would be quite important for us to know which thing Chazal is doing, whether it's parshanut or darshanut, whether it's trying to figure out or interpret the text from within or impose an interpretation on the text, because in the latter case, if someone thinks that that's actually a true interpretation of the text, they're mistaken.
Okay, so it's a little more complicated than that, and I'll tell you why. That's why you're supposed to learn Midrash. Like, basically, I wrote the book because I got fed up with people saying it's just a Midrash. Nobody would say it's just a sugya in Gittin. Nobody would say that, right? I would say it's just a sugya of avodah zarah. We don't really have to know what it means. No, of course you have to know what it means. That means you have to analyze, you have to read, you have to interpret, you have to pause, you have to ask questions, you have to put it together, you have to understand what you're reading. That said, there's something that you have to be aware of when you read Midrash, right? I'm speaking about Midrash aggadah, which is that the redactors of the texts that we're talking about, whether they were in the Gemara or in separate collections of Midrash, took oral teachings by Chachamim from different periods and at different, doing different things with the text, and composed them or redacted them into a final form, which, by the way, was never meant to be the case. Oral Torah was supposed to be oral Torah. And there were lots of reasons. We don't have to go into that. Why oral Torah was eventually written down in the form that it was written down. So when you say it's really important to know whether someone's doing pshat or drash or parshanut or darshanut, the answer is oral traditions float. You could get a midrash that's brought here in Shemot Rabbah and something similar brought in the Yerushalmi, and they will mean different things depending on the uses to which they are put. And there are often interpretive elements even in homiletical texts, and there are sometimes in interpretive texts homiletical. It's not as cut and dried, especially because Chazal didn't draw those rigid distinctions. If you learn a piece of Gemara, you know that they can start with a halachic discussion and then sort of drift into or go on to a tangent about a story in Tanakh. Menachot in talking about Gid Hanashe, and then we're with Yaakov and Esav at the moment when the Yaakov fights with the Malach. So it's yes, we have to say to ourselves, okay, what are they basing this on? What are they looking at in text? What are they noticing here? What's the problem they see that I didn't see? How are they solving that problem? Why do they give me 4 readings here instead of 2 readings here, et cetera, et cetera?
It's funny because I actually plan to ask some of these questions later on in our conversation, but I'm just really fascinated by this question. So as long as we're talking about the fluidity of the way that Chazal treated Midrash, let me ask you in terms of what we nowadays, I realize they did not have this term, but what we nowadays would call the historical reality behind what they're describing. Does Chazal not care about that at all, given the fact that they're going back and forth between homiletics and interpretation? Or did they actually care about what actually happened? In other words, when they give a Midrash aggadah that's talking about certain things that may or may not have happened, whether it's literal or not literal, do they care actually the story, or they care more about the message, regardless of whether historically it's actually true?
I think it would depend on the text. Let me see if I can answer this by making reference to parshanut hamikra. Okay, and in this respect, this might be an easier way to answer it. What happened at Meraglim? Who sent the Meraglim? Who sent the spies to Eretz Yisrael? Was it, as Rashi says, or as the Ramban says, and a big machloket between the two of them? Did God send the Meraglim? Did Moshe send the Meraglim? Did the people send the Meraglim? Who sent the Meraglim? Now, the text tells us what it tells us, and the biblical text is written in a way that requires analysis and reading and careful, close reading of the text. I'm familiar with the work of Eric Auerbach, who was a German Jewish literary critic. He wrote a very important article called Odysseus' Scar, in which he compares the story of a story from the Odyssey to Akedat Yitzchak, and he shows how the Torah is written in a way that absolutely requires interpretation. I mean, arguably everything requires interpretation, down to some stupid Twitter tweet or something, because any text requires interpretation. But he was saying that there's a fundamental difference between the Greek tradition, in which things were spelled out much more explicitly, and the Torah lahavdil, or Tanakh lahavdil, which is written in a manner that leaves so many questions, or creates so many questions. And if you look at the Netziv's introduction to his Perush HaTorah, that's one of the things he talks about, is that the Torah is a shirah. And the difference between poetry and prose is you really have to interpret poetry. You have to try to figure out what the references are. You have to, add a lot of water to make the text make sense, etc. So let me get back to what I was saying. So the question is, what happened? Who sent the Meraglim? And I remember having this discussion with Rav I knew who had written some parshanut texts on. He had a parshanut Torah that he was writing, and I said, what do you think the job of the parshan is? I said that to him because I kept coming across what I thought was a problem with what he was saying. And he said, I think the job of the parshan is to figure out what happened. He said, what do you think the job of the parshan is? I said, I think the job of the parshan is to figure out what the text means. We'll never know exactly what happened at Meraglim. Even if we were there, we wouldn't necessarily know what happens at Meraglim. We want to know what the Torah is trying to tell us about Meraglim. And I think that that's an approach that we can take with Chazal as well. Look, often Chazal use language that is metaphorical, or they assume that the reader understands that they're speaking in a metaphorically, that's the Rambam. The idea that, and most of the Rishonim follow that shita, which is that when Chazal say something that doesn't really make sense in terms of, actuality or even the plain sense of the psukim, what they're doing is they're using language figuratively. They're using, parable or allegory or story to illustrate or to make their point. And you have to unpack that and understand what it means. I think for Chazal, there are broadly speaking, two things they're doing. They're either using the texts as a place to convey sermonic, homiletical messages, or they're trying to tell you, well, there's clearly a problem in the way this is written. What do we do with this? And they explain it that way. And the fact that, for example, one example that I, as a Nach teacher, I used a lot of Midrash because it's a lot of Nach, you can't understand that Midrash. Just to give you one example, is when Shaul asks Avner whose son David is, who was David's father. And in the previous parak, this is the David and Goliath story, in the previous parak, he sends a letter to David's father saying, I want David to come and stay with me. So he clearly knows who his father is. We get a long, interesting dialogue that Chazal sort of insert there between Shaul and Avner. And they insert also another story there where Shaul gives him his armor and it fits on David and Shaul is made uncomfortable and all of that. Do they mean that literally they had that conversation? I doubt it. The conversation that they construct between Shaul and Avner is a way of conveying their understanding that Shaul has become nervous about David's potential to be the next king. And I don't think they literally mean that's exactly the conversation that happened, or that David literally fit into Shaul's clothing, even though he couldn't have, because Shaul was much taller than him. They are aware, but this is the way they talk, this is the way they teach.
That's very interesting. That's a really good example. And in fact, now that you're mentioning Shaul, let me ask another question about Shaul, because you said that, in your opinion, the job of the biblical interpreter of the Parshan is to tell us what the text wants us to think happened, what the text is saying happened. Mm-hmm. I was learning Sefer Shmuel Aleph with my 14-year-old daughter, Batsheva. One case that comes up there is the situation where Shmuel Hanavi, the prophet Shmuel, tells Shaul that he will no longer be the king because he failed with regard to Amalek, however we understand that failure exactly. And then someone turns around and grabs the cloak and it tears. And the question is, whose cloak tears? Part of the question there is, obviously, it's either one or the other historically, but I like to understand it as intentional ambiguity, meaning the text itself makes sure that we don't know. In other words, the text doesn't want us to know. It wants us to suppose both possibilities. Is that possible?
I think so. I think that it's, or let's put it this way. Think about Pilegesh Begivah. You have two Chachamim learning the story of Pilegesh Begivah. And one of them says to the other, what was the thing that made her husband angry at her, that made her run away? And each one of them gives a different interpretation, and they each quote a pasuk to give a proof text for their contention. And then one of them runs into Eliyahu Hanavi, and he says to him, Oh, we were just learning this. Well, what is, you were just up in Shemaim. He says, what did Hakadosh Baruch Hu say? And he said, Bini Rabbi so-and-so says this. He was learning, oh, guess what? Yes, he was learning Pilegesh Begiba. Eliyahu says he was learning Pilegesh Begiba. And Bini Rabbi so-and-so says this, and Bini Rabbi so-and-so says that. So Eliyahu Hanavi's interlocutor says to him, I'm not getting the exact lashon, but is there a doubt in heaven? Doesn't God know what happens if he look at Megillah? And he says, yes, of course God knows. But elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. What does that mean? That means that Chazal were very conscious of the fact, and we see it all over the place in the Tanu Rosh Halachnai, or in many other places where Chazal are very much aware that Rabbi Akiva, Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't understand what Rabbi Akiva is saying in his Beit Midrash. Chazal were very much aware that the interpretive enterprise was something that they took and ran with as part of the extension of Torah Shabbal Peh, as part of what the Jewish people do with the text. Does God know exactly what happened in Meraglim? Does God know exactly what happened at Pilegesh Begiva? Did something exact happen? Yeah, so what? I mean, in a sense that not every detail of Meraglim is told to us in the Torah, only the parts that we are meant to grapple with interpretively, that's what God wants us to do, to learn and understand them. Yes, so sometimes you could say it's deliberately ambiguous.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I want to go back to the beginning when we were talking about your definition of midrash. I'd like to ask, what makes midrash different from other forms of biblical interpretation?
Oh, it's a very good question. Part of it is the period. Midrash is either from the period of the Tanaim and the Moraim, that is to say, it's linked to the period of Chazal, which has ramifications, which I'll explain in a minute. And part of it is because it's Chazal, the scope, which brings us back to our analogy to the Greeks, right? In other words, Rashi, the Ramban, the Ibn Ezra, the Sforno, all the Rishonim, and many of the Achronim, what do? They say, we're not going to talk about the big, enormous picture of what this text can give rise to. It's the narrowing for the Parshanim, for the post-Chazal, probably starting with the Kohanim, maybe even before the Saboraim, not that I know anything about the Saboraim, but the idea that we're going to narrow our focus, we're going to ask certain kinds of questions. We're going to ask questions about extraneous language, about grammar, about context, about contradictions in the text, difficulties in the text, and we are going to narrow our focus only to that, broadly speaking. So Chazal's focus is very broad, but perhaps I think the thing that most confuses people and makes people misunderstand Midrash is that Chazal are pre-Western style writing, or pre-Greek, if you will.
What do you mean?
What I mean is that when Chazal want to convey even a very sophisticated concept or interpretation, they use not prose and not linear argumentation. They use parable, metaphor, simile, story, narrative expansion. They use figurative language, which means we who are used to associating figurative language with fiction have to unpack that and translate it into language that is more prose linear argumentation. And we're bad at that. That's part of the reason I wrote the book.
It's very interesting because the way you're describing Midrash in that particular way, the pre-Greek or pre-Western method of thinking through story, is very distinct from the way the Mishnah or the Gemara actually treats logic, which is much more linear. It's not the same linear logic that we may be used to in Greek thinking, but it is not necessarily parables. It's a much more, I'll call it Western for lack of a better term.
Well, let me see if I can give you an example. If you look at Parshat Mishpatim, for example, when you're talking about categories of damages, you're talking about Bor B'Reshut Harabim, for example, the concept of a pit in the public domain, right? That's not literally meant to be understood as a pit in the public domain. It's meant to be understood as a category of damages. Now, what does the Mishnah and the Gemara do? What does Midrash Halacha do? There are rules for translating those encapsulations. It's an image, right? You see a pit in the public domain, you see a pit in the public domain, you've got police tape around it, and you see the dirt around it and all of that, and you have an instinctive grasp of what kind of form of damages we're speaking about, right? That's what you have. What does Midrash Halacha do? What does the Mishnah do and the Gemara? They have to translate not it into not concepts, but into concrete halachic implications, right? Concrete halachic questions. And so the mechanism in Midrash Halacha or in Torah Sheba'al Peh of the nature of Mishnah, which starts with Mishnah, is different, but it starts in the Torah with an image that a child could understand. And in fact, that's what the Rambam says, that Chazal, he doesn't exactly say this, but the Chazal were the mamshichei derech of, why should we wonder that we have to interpret the words of Chazal? Chazal understood that they had to interpret the words of the Torah.
Okay, let me ask you another question that you discuss in your book. You talk about the fact that people often conflate Midrash and aggadah. Could you just briefly define the differences between them?
Midrash means it's a pasuk-based limud. Aggadah is not. The stories of Rabbi Akiva are not based on psukim. What makes Midrash Halacha and Midrash Aggadah have in common that they are a pasuk-based limud. They're always based in some biblical text. For example, historiography, stories of the Chachamim, things like that are not pasuk-based limud. That's Midrash. That's why Midrash, when I said is a style of text study, that's what I meant.
Now, why is it important for people to learn Midrash? In other words, many people in yeshivot will learn Mishnah and Gemara. That's the bulk of their time. And midrashim are something which they may use for homiletics if they have to say the Torah on Friday night, but they're not going to pay it serious attention very often. I'm assuming, given the book that you wrote, that you think that's a mistake. Why is it important to learn this additional genre of Chazal's literature?
Well, first of all, if Chazal took the trouble out of the vast amount of Torah Sheba'al Peh that they did not write down, if they took the trouble to preserve this in writing, then it's clearly important. But I think there's another issue here. And again, I am not advocating that people drop the hours upon hours that they use for learning Gemara and Halacha to learn Midrash. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about creating a certain sense of rigor around Midrash, and I think that's important. Is one of the things that happens more in the modern Orthodox community than in the Haredi community, but it's a disaster educationally, is that people are being taught to not take Chazal seriously. They bifurcate the work of Chazal. If you want students to take the Shakla V'Tarya and the diyunim, the sugiyot that they learn in halacha, you want them to take those seriously. And you tell them, don't worry about Midrash Aggadah, just skip it. It's not important. You are doing what I call the law of unintended consequences in education, which is you're creating a dichotomy that undermines their belief that Chazal were brilliant, important, and have everything to teach us about everything. Because I don't know, again, maybe you can enlighten me. I don't know if I invented this term or if I read it somewhere and forgot where I read it. I've been trying to get someone to tell me if it's written down anywhere. Chazal are the vast unconscious of the Jewish people. And you ignore your unconscious at your peril. Any idea that is legitimately Jewish is found somewhere in Tanakh or in Chazal and probably in both. And if you ignore Midrash Aggadah or you treat it lightly, you are telling yourself, your students, your children, that Chazal had this like silly side or something. You're not teaching them to truly respect Chazal. If they ignore Chazal, Judaism, as we know it today, and I'm speaking about the observant community. I don't like to use the word Orthodox, but I'll use the word Orthodox for the purposes of convention. People who feel fidelity to Torah, it's through Chazal. And if they don't have that, they don't have that real respect, you can kiss them goodbye. Even if they go through the motions, it's not really serious.
That phrase, the vast unconscious of the Jewish people, that's fantastic. I'm going to take that with me. That's really,
Good.
that says a
And if you
lot.
find somebody who knows where I may have read it, I will be thrilled. Otherwise, I invented it. I'm not sure.
I
Yeah.
just think very often, I almost say, admittedly, this is tongue in cheek. I don't mean halachically this is true, but to the degree somebody tries to learn part of Tanakh without any interpretation whatsoever, just to read the words, I know that is a kiyum of learning Torah according to halacha. But on some level, learning it, quote unquote, academically without using Chazal whatsoever, in my mind, I'm not sure that's real limud Torah, because learning Torah is through the lens of Chazal. It's not really Torah otherwise.
There's another thing that I think is really, really important about this. Every literature, lahavdil, right? Every literature has a cultural underpinning from which it comes. And for us to think we can approach Tanakh without without Torah Shabbat Pam, without the whole cultural underpinning of our society is arrogant beyond belief. I mean, if you think about it, I remember that it struck me very forcibly. I was trying to read Japanese literature in translation. And I was reading it. And I assume it was a good translation. I was reading a book of short stories. Then I tried a novel. I tried. I was curious, and I tried. And I said, and I'm a person who has certain literary sensitivities. I'm interested in things. I'm interested in literature, and I'm reading this stuff, and some of it was quite beautiful. And I'm thinking, I don't understand this. I don't understand this. There's something behind the veil here that I'm not getting. And that's because I'm a Western person. I don't have enough familiarity with that culture. I'm not going to understand what they're talking about. And I think that, again, by analogy, if you pick up the Tanakh, especially if you pick it up in translation, and you think you understand it without Chazal, without the parshanim, then you're just being foolish. Oh, by the way, there is something to be said for after you've learned, you sort of you have stuff under your belt, right? You've got material under your belt. You go back and read the psukim again. That can be a very interesting exercise because all of a sudden the psukim start to make sense in a way that you start to notice things in the text that you wouldn't otherwise know. And I always say Chazal taught me to pay attention to key words, not Martin Buber. No, it was Chazal. They sensitized us to these kinds of things.
I once heard, whether it's true or not, I don't know, that the Vilna Gaon, towards the end of his life, once he had learned everything many times, the way he learned was he opened a Sefer Torah and simply read the psukim without any nikudot, simply reading the verses
from the cloth.
From
yes,
the cloth.
Yes, I heard that too. It's apparently, if it's not true, then it conveys
should
a
be.
truth. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about some of the methodologies that one uses in learning Midrash and understanding Midrash, because one of the problems I have in reading Midrash myself is I read a Midrash and I think I have a great interpretation. I think I understand it. But without a set methodology, I don't necessarily know if I'm really interpreting the text or if I'm imposing my own meaning on the text without recognizing it. So can you talk about some of the methodologies that are typically used in order to understand Midrash?
So I would say one thing is, first of all, slow down, read slow. Read more than once, read maybe more than 5 times, right? Just slow down and read slow. Always start with the psukim. A midrash is always a pasuk-based limud. It's always based on something in Tanakh. Go to the psukim. Read through the psukim. Read through them again. Then read the midrash. Then ask yourself, what is the midrash trying to address in the psukim? Then go back to the psukim. See if you're right? And then go back to the midrash and piece by piece, right? Oh, okay, this midrash has 4 parts. It starts with a quote from Yeshayahu. It then raises a question, then it uses a parable, and then it gives us a conclusion. Okay, what is each part doing? Do I understand the words? Do I understand what it's doing? Can I read it back into the text? You go back to the psukim, keep going back to the psukim. In fact, in my new book, I wrote a chapter which I called an interpretive toolbox. One of the big things is slow down and give it the kind of attention. And people are bad at this today because the internet has trained us to read in a very, very superficial way. Slow down, read it again, 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 and go back to the psukim again and again and again. And get used to thinking carefully, ask yourself questions, answer those questions, and see does it hang together? That's the short answer.
But that brings me back to something we talked about at the beginning, about the difference between homiletics and interpretation. If Chazal in a given place were engaged in darshanut, they were not trying to give me pshat. They were not trying to give me the simple meaning of the text. And I'm now treating it like they are by doing what you're saying, when in fact they were sermonizing, so to speak. Am I not in danger of getting something wrong or reading into that midrash something that's not there?
First of all, you're always in danger of getting something wrong. That's true no matter what you're reading. It comes with the territory. But second of all, even if you're learning a homily, if you're learning a sermon, right, they're using it sermonically, they're not using it interpretively. They chose that text for a reason, right? In other words, there's a reason that they have picked up this pasuk or this episode and read it the way that they read it. And if you get the feeling that there's no interpretive issue they're addressing, then you say to yourself, okay, what's the sermonic nugget here that they are trying to elucidate? What are they trying to say? And there's some very interesting midrashim about tshuva that Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana says, Ein va'ata ela tshuva. Whenever it says ata with an ayin in the Torah, it's about tshuva. So if you look at all the examples that he brings, you start to see that he's got a point. Now, he doesn't have a point in the sense of this is the only possible perush of this pasuk or this story. And not every place that it says atah with an ayin is talking about tshuva, but there's something about tshuva that requires now, right? And he's picking that up. He's picking that up. And that's what makes it a beautiful sermon. And we've all heard bad sermons. A good sermon is when a good sermonizer, a good darshan, takes something that is aesthetically pleasing and thought-provoking and makes you think about it and feel it. And when Chazal are writing sermons, they're very good too. So, yeah.
You mentioned aesthetically pleasing, and you mentioned before the Nitziv, who talks about Torah as a shirah, as a poem or a song. So I'd like to ask about Midrash in that same way. And perhaps there's no one answer to this question, but to what degree do we, in the 21st century, maintain interpretive freedom when reading a Midrash? In other words, to continue the job of Chazal when they were using it as homiletics with the text of the Torah or Tanakh, and we want to do the same. Did Chazal intend for us to read every Midrash, the Midrash itself, somewhat literally, or to get a specific single message out of it? Or,
no, I don't think so.
So you think it's more, my question really was, is Midrash supposed to be more like music or a painting where there's interpretive freedom as opposed to a philosophical text which is supposed to lead to a single conclusion?
Both.
Okay, can you explain that?
Let me see if I can put it this way. When you learn Midrash a lot, one of the things that you notice is that Chazal will, I'll give you an example. It's in my next book. Shtayim nitkasu b'tza'iv v'yaldu ta'omim. Two people covered themselves with veils and had twins. Okay. Chazal dropped that in your lap, and they're inviting you to the conversation because it's Torah Shebaal Peh. What does that mean? Okay, so it's Rivka and Tamar, right? Shtayim nitkasu b'tza'iv v'yaldu ta'omim. Well, it turns out when you investigate the words tza'if and ta'omim, the word tza'if appears twice in Tanakh, with Rivka and with Tamar, and nowhere else. Okay, red alert, red alert, red alert, right? Clearly there's something in that. The second interesting thing is the only two women in Tanakh who have twin babies are Rivka and Tamar. Now, they don't spell it. This is why we said, Shtayim nitkasu b'tza'iv v'yaldu ta'omim. They don't spell it out. They drop it in your lap when they say, figure it out. Or, Yehuda and Tamar, and the Yosef story being interrupted with Yehuda and Tamar story. Okay? And what do Chazal say? Kedei lismoch haker lahaker, kedei lismoch yerida liyerida. There's a third opinion there. It's in the book if you want to read the whole piece. Kedei lismoch haker lahaker, in order to connect, recognize to recognize, and to connect a descent to a descent. Okay? They drop it in our lap. And then what do they expect us to do? Figure it out. It's Torah Shebaal Peh. And I've taught these texts many times. And often, not always, but often my students will have insights I never thought of. And that is exciting. That's incredible. I have a certain amount of experience. I spend a lot of time. I read the Midrash over and over and over again. I go back to the Pesukim, and then I say, okay, why? But really, this isn't the same kind of descent. This is a different kind of descent. So what's the comparison they're making? What do we do with this? That's Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, can you definitively prove that the way you're reading it is right? No, you could probably prove you're reading it wrong. But Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim.
That's so interesting. You're speaking now about a type of, I'm not sure it's quite a mashal here. This is more a notation of something that's going on, but it reminds me of the concept of a mashal, the concept of a simile or a metaphor, which midrashim often use. Before we talked about methodology and understanding midrash, now I'd like to talk about methodology that the midrash uses, and mashal is a great example of that. Why would a midrash use a mashal? Is it in order to give us that interpretive freedom, to give us more ideas that we can all mine from it, or are there other ideas that it's trying to bring out?
I think okay, but this is the way, and I didn't put this in the other book, but I maybe I should put it in the next book. Why do Chazal write the way they do? That's what my students always ask me. Why do they have to write that way? Why couldn't they just tell us what they mean? Why? So the short answer is that Chazal were writing in the style and the language of their time. That's the way people talked in the ancient in the ancient Near East. It's in the literature of many other cultures in the ancient Near East. That's the way it is. That's what you got. And so they use that. Why does the Torah tell us profound concepts about Mesirut Nefesh through the story of the aggadah instead of writing a philosophical treatise? The Torah was given in a place and a time and in a manner that made it accessible to everybody. A child will understand the aggadah one way. An adult will understand it a different way. A Talmid Chacham will understand it a third way. A Makubal will understand it a fourth way, and everything in between. Okay, Chazal wrote in a language that was the Rambam calls it practical philosophy. Hachelek ha'ma'asi shel ha'filosophia. In other words, the idea that in a manner that makes Chazal were interested in making themselves accessible at all different levels of knowledge and understanding. And that means that, you can tell the story in Gan, the Midrash in Gan, and the kid will get something. And you learn the story in fourth grade, or the parable in fourth grade more rigorously, the kid will get a lot more. By the time they're an adult, they can really get it. They can really get something. And the more they know, the more they'll get. It's expandable.
You wrote in your book, Simi, that two key elements in understanding a mashal are, what does the mashal add that I would not have understood without it? And this is the part I want to ask about because I found this to be fascinating. What can I learn from the discrepancies between the mashal and that which it is trying to explain, or the text itself? Can you explain what you mean and why that's important?
Okay, so I think if you read through the examples, you'll see why that's important. I really learned this from Professor Yonah Frankel, alav shalom, and it was, I think, the single most helpful insight I got about Midrash anywhere, which is, look, think about it this way. In all of the Mishalim, all you would have had to do would be to expand the dialogue. You just expand the dialogue. Why do you need the mashal? What does the mashal add? Because again, there are places where Chazal just expand the dialogue or expand the story and through that explain what they're explaining.
Can you actually give an example of that? I know, for example, in your book, you talk about the warrior and the king with the aggadah as a great example of that, just so my listeners will have some idea of what you're talking about in a more concrete way.
Okay, so the mashal that we're talking about here is on a word, essentially, a word that is a problematic word in the aggadah story. Hashem says, "Kach na et bincha et yichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak, v'lech lecha el eretz haMoriya, va'alei sham le'olah al achat ha'arim asher omar lecha." Kach na, please take. Okay, now the word nun aleph in Tanakh can mean either please or it can mean now. Tanchuma chooses the word please instead of the word now. So it's take please your son, your only one, the one you love, etc., and take him up and offer him as a burnt offering. Well, one question we can ask is why did they choose the please instead of the now? I think there's a technical answer for that, which is simply that Abraham doesn't just leap up and do it right then. He waits till the next day. But na means bakasha. So the Tanchuma says, Ein na ela l'shon bakasha. Na means please. Mashal lemelech basar v'adam she'amdu alav milchamot harbe. Maybe I'll just say it in English. It might be easier. Okay, there's a king who, flesh and blood, who had many wars happen to him, and he had one warrior who won all of the wars. After some days, there was a particularly hard war that came upon him, and the king said to that warrior, I request of you, please, stand for me in this war, meaning win the war, so that my generals will not say those first wars had no substance, meaning those first wars were no big deal. Your warrior won those wars because they were no big deal. Even so, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Abraham, I have tested you with 9 tests, and you have withstood them. Now stand for me in this test, which is the aggadah, right? So that they will not say those first tests had no substance. Okay, so in the methodology that I use, we line up the characters in the mashal. We have a king. We have lots of wars. We have a warrior who wins all the wars. Then we have the big war. And the king says to the warrior, please stand for me in this war so that my generals will not say those first wars were no big deal. Okay, so preferably with the blackboard, but we don't have one here. Who's the king? Hit it.
King is God.
Right. What are the milchamot harbe? What are the many wars?
The previous 9 tests, presumably.
The previous 9 tests. And the gibor, the warrior, is?
Avraham Avinu.
Right. And he wins all the wars?
He passed all the tests.
Okay. Then there's the tough war.
That's the aggadah.
That's the aggadah. And the king says to the warrior, God says to Abraham, Kachna bivakasha mimcha, please pass this test so that my generals, who are the generals?
Perhaps the nations of the world, people who look dubiously upon Abraham's achievement.
We don't know yet.
We don't know yet, okay.
Okay. Those first wars had no substance. Those first tests had no substance.
They were easy.
Right. So now let's think about this. There's the king, and there are many wars. And we said those many wars are?
The previous tests.
The previous tests. Okay. Go to the nimshal, go to the unpacking of the mashal. God says to Abram, I have tested you with 9 tests, and you have withstood them. There's a discrepancy here. What's the discrepancy? In the mashal, in the parable, the wars are against the king. The wars are against the king. In the nimshal, which is our unpacking of the mashal, who are the tests for?
Abraham.
What did the Midrash just do? It conflated the distinction between the tests of Abraham and the wars of God. If we didn't notice that discrepancy, we would not understand what the Midrash is saying. What is the Midrash saying? All along, we've been thinking God has tested Abraham for his own reasons, or maybe to make Abraham a better person, or maybe who knows what, right? What are we understanding here now in this Midrash because of the discrepancy? God is testing Abraham for God's own sake.
Whatever that means.
What does that mean? Well, let's take a look at the rest of the mashal. Okay, I'm really doing this al regel achad. I hope
please. It's great.
You don't mind.
It's
Okay,
great.
The big test is the aggadah. Let's say Abraham fails the test. Well, in the mashal, we're told, don't fail this test, right? Pass this test so that my generals will not say those first tests had no substance. Who are God's generals? What does it matter what they say? If you look at the nimshal, it doesn't tell us who the generals are. It just says, so that they will not say those first tests had no substance. Who's present at the aggadah, Scott? Who is present at the aggadah?
Very much only Abraham and Yitzchak along with Hashem, so to speak.
Oh, Abraham, Yitzchak, Hashem.
There was a malach also, but whatever.
A malach. Who
a
else?
ram.
Who else is present at the aggadah? You are. I am. How are we present at the aggadah? We have a God's eye view of the aggadah. How do we know about the aggadah? Because it's written in the Torah. We're reading the story of the aggadah. We are God's generals, right? He's the great warrior, but we're the generals. We're in God's army. How do we know about the aggadah? Because God put it in the Torah, so we would read about it. What happens if the aggadah ends with Avram saying, I'm sorry, God, I don't want to disappoint you, but I can't do it? What will we say? We, the reader of the text.
He's not willing to go all the way.
He's not willing to go all the way. And why is that important? Why would that be a disaster? What's the message of the aggadah, according to Tanchuma? There is no limit. There is no limit to what you have to give God. What is God saying to Abraham? If you fail this test, your descendants will say, God says, Lech Lecha, I could do that. God says, Brit Milah, I could do that. God says, your heart, your mind, your body, your soul, even that which is more precious to you than yourself, I, God, demanded of you. What will we say? Well, Abraham got this far, but he didn't do the last mile.
And neither do I.
And I don't have to either. Please, Abraham, Tanchuma is saying, please do it for me. Because the tests were never about you. They were about who was watching. And who's watching? The Jewish people down the ages. We wouldn't get that without the discrepancies. There's a gap. Who are the king's generals? And there's the fact that 9 tests doesn't really line up with, wait a minute, in the mashal, they're God's tests, not Abraham's tests.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That is really enlightening. Thank you. I have a lot to think about now. That's very, very good. Would it be okay if we talk about exploring stories in the Midrash? You talk about, for example, the story of Avraham. We'll stay on Avraham for now. Avraham breaking his father's idols, a very famous story. And you said, I'm going to quote you.
Every Ganenet has taught that story.
Exactly. He said, very few people have actually studied this Midrash at its source. As a result, it is mistakenly seen as a child's tale with a simple moralizing message, rather than as a subtle discussion of complex issues lying at the heart of Judaism. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
One of the things that happens in this story is it's about how social pressure makes people do things that they don't even necessarily believe in. One of the other things that, I mean, really, again, I'm really saying this al regel achat. Another thing that this story is talking about is the idea that at some point you have to put your money where your mouth is, or you even have to put your life on the line. You have to stand up for what you really believe in. The miracle in that story is not that Abraham is saved from the burning furnace by God. He doesn't expect that. This is before Lech Lecha. God has not spoken to him yet. He has no idea if someone's watching over him right now. But that at a certain point he says, well, either I go to war with my father's society, or I'm just like everybody else. And I don't mean that as a rebellious statement, right? But I'm just like everybody else in going along with the big lie, the big damaging lie. And that's the greatness of Abraham. The miracle is not that Abraham is saved from the burning furnace by God. The miracle is that Abraham finds the courage to stand up against Nimrod and fight for what he believes in, even at possibly the loss to his own life.
Okay.
And that's just al regel achat.
I understand. I'm asking you to talk about texts and midrashim, which you don't have in front of you. We could go on for hours. Of course, people can and should also read the book, which was just published also in Hebrew as well. It's called Learning to Read Midrash. But one more example, if it's okay, Simi. You talk about the idea of engaging the reader in dialogue. Can you explain what that means?
I mean that the example I gave there is from the Midrash about Yonah, right? Where you have 5 proof texts, which is kind of unusual. Usually you have there's something called a ptichta, where Chazal take a pasuk from someplace that's unrelated to the text that they're discussing, and they use it as an interpretive device. Again, there are all sorts of interesting things that Chazal do with psukim that again, al regel achat. But one of the things that they do there is they cite 5 proof texts in a row before they tell you the narrative, before they tell you the answer to the question that they raise, and then the mashal, the parable that they use to talk about it. So the question is, why do they cite 5 proof texts? And one of the things that they're doing is they're asking you, the reader, to read the proof text and say, okay, how is this connected to what follows? Or how is this connected to the text that's being discussed? And then you figure that out. And then you go to the next proof text and you say, well, why do I need the second proof text if I have the first proof text? And why do I need the third proof text if I have the first two proof texts? And what they're asking you to do, and I said this before with regard to just dropping a hint and then asking you to think about it and talk about it and work it out yourself, is they're asking you to enter into a dialogue with the text and say, okay, but why are they putting this here? Is it because of this? Well, then you get the next proof text and you say, well, no, because they brought a second proof, a third, a fourth, a fifth. And so there's a dialogue that's created the same way that we get the dialogue with, as I said, the insertion of the Yehuda and Tamar story into the middle of the Yosef story, or the idea that I'm going to drop this bomb on you, or little bomb, right? Two women with veils who have twins. Figure it out. That's the invitation to the dialogue.
The idea of our being in dialogue with Chazal definitely, it brings to life this concept that we know the Chazal are living and breathing now, but they actually are asking us to continue to interpret them. And it really is something which exists today in our spiritual and intellectual Weltanschauung. They're with us today telling us and engaging in dialogue with us, and we're able to do so.
And we know that if we have a classic yeshivish education or yeshiva education, we know that about Gemara, and in halachic terms, well, it continues. It's also in Midrash aggadah and everything that Chazal write. Chazal wrote their Torah Shebaal Peh in a manner that preserved its orality so that we could enter into figuring it out. We need teachers to explain it to us, and we need to enter into a dialogue with teachers, with the text, and work on it. That's Torah Chaim. That's what keeps it alive. It's not on the shelf. It's not in the shelf.
I know Rav Soloveitchik talks about that idea in Uvikashtem Misham. He talks about how the Rambam was a living, breathing person that he experienced listening from his bed as a child as his father taught students around him. And he felt the Rambam was there as an actual person. Or in another essay entitled The First Jewish Grandfather, which he said at someone's Pidyon Haben, I believe, he talks about the experience of going to Shiur, feeling like an old man. But then an older man walks in, Rav Chaim Brisker, his grandfather. And then after that, Rashi comes in, the Rambam, they take their seats around the table, and the conversation between generations becomes real. And he says it's not merely an imaginary experience for him. This is a true to life experience.
Right. And I think if it's done right educationally, we can recreate that in our classrooms and in our homes.
Okay, well, I could continue listening to you all day long. This is so fascinating. And I want to thank you for providing your insights today and for writing so many of them down in the book. And thank you very much for joining me. I think everyone who listened today, speaking for myself, and I'm sure for many listeners, has a lot to think about, and I'm sure a renewed appreciation for Midrash. Simi Peters, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'd love to talk about Midrash, so this was a big treat. Thank you very much.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers. And you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com.